Kelly's World Season 1 Review, Episode 5. In the previous episode, we examined how global conflict and ideological struggle reshaped political systems and led to the emergence of a new global order after World War II. In this episode, we will explore how that global system developed over time and how it continues to shape the modern world. We will begin with the Cold War, a prolonged period of ideological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that redefined global politics through indirect conflict, military alliances, and competing visions for economic and political organization. We will then examine how this rivalry played out in specific regions, particularly in Latin America and Asia, where local conditions combined with global pressures to produce instability, revolution, and divergent paths of development. From there, we will explore the process of decolonization and the challenges faced by newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Finally, we will examine the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the contemporary global system, including the persistence of regional conflicts, the rise of new forms of warfare, and the continued impact of globalization. Together, these developments illustrate how the modern world has been shaped by both cooperation and conflict, and how historical forces continue to influence global relationships today. Lesson 26: The Cold War. The Cold War emerged directly out of the aftermath of World War II, as the global balance of power shifted dramatically. With much of Europe devastated and traditional powers like Britain and France weakened, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, rose to dominance. Although they had been allies during the war, their relationship was always uneasy, rooted in deep ideological differences. The United States promoted democracy, capitalism, and open markets, while the Soviet Union supported communism, centralized control, and a state-directed economy. Once their common enemy was defeated, these differences quickly resurfaced and shaped a new global conflict. The way World War II ended made this conflict almost inevitable. Both superpowers occupied key regions, especially in Europe, where the Soviet Union established control over Eastern Europe while the United States supported Western Europe. This created a divided continent and a bipolar world system. Each side viewed the other not just as a rival, but as a fundamental threat to its political and economic model. Rather than fighting directly, the Cold War was defined by indirect competition. One major strategy was containment, a policy developed by the United States to prevent the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine marked a turning point, committing the United States to support countries resisting communist influence. This approach expanded into economic aid programs like the Marshall Plan and military alliances such as NATO. At the same time, the Soviet Union pursued its own strategic goals. Having suffered enormous losses during World War II, it sought security through the creation of a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. It also aimed to rebuild its economy, expanding its influence and maintain its status as a global superpower. These competing goals ensured ongoing tension. Proxy wars became a defining feature of the Cold War. Conflicts in places like Korea and Vietnam allowed the superpowers to compete indirectly by supporting opposing sides. These wars often caused immense destruction in the regions where they were fought, even though they were part of a larger global struggle. The Cold War can also be understood as a reconfigured form of imperialism. Instead of direct colonial rule, both superpowers exerted influence through economic aid, military support, and political intervention. Newly independent nations were often drawn into this competition, limiting their ability to act independently. Finally, the Cold War was not only political and military, it was symbolic. The Berlin Wall, for example, physically divided East and West, but also represented the broader ideological divide between communism and democracy. Its eventual fall signaled the weakening of Soviet control and the approaching end of the Cold War era. In conclusion, the Cold War reshaped global politics by creating a divided world defined by ideological competition, indirect conflict, and competing visions for the future. Its influence extended across continents, shaping the development of nations and the structure of the modern world. Lesson 27: Latin America during the Cold War. Although most countries in Latin America achieved political independence in the early 19th century, they continued to experience many of the same conditions that shaped post colonial struggles in Africa and Asia. Independence did not dismantle the economic structures established under colonial rule. Instead, Latin American economies remained heavily dependent on exporting raw materials such as coffee, sugar, bananas, and oil, while importing manufactured goods from more industrialized countries. This created long term economic vulnerability and reinforced deep social inequality. Political power in many countries remained concentrated in the hands of elites, large landowners, and business interests, who often worked closely with foreign investors. For much of the population, especially in rural areas, poverty and a lack of political representation persisted. In this context, Marxism became an appealing framework because it offered an explanation for inequality and a language for resistance. Many movements framed their struggles not simply as domestic issues, but as part of a broader fight against imperialism and foreign control. However, attempts to implement Marxist systems often produced instability. This was not necessarily because Marxism itself was inherently unworkable, but because it developed in fragile political environments under intense external pressure. Many Latin American countries lacked strong democratic institutions or large industrial working classes, meaning revolutionary movements often relied on guerrilla warfare or military action. This made new governments more likely to become authoritarian as they struggled to maintain control. External influence, particularly from the United States, played a decisive role. During the Cold War, the United States viewed leftist governments in Latin America as strategic threats and frequently intervened to prevent their success. This included economic pressure, covert operations, and support for military coups as seen in Guatemala and Chile. These interventions often undermined democratic governments and reinforced the perception that foreign powers continued to shape Latin American politics. The role of foreign corporations further contributed to instability. The United Fruit Company, for example, controlled large portions of land and infrastructure in several countries, influencing government policy and economic development. When reformist governments attempted land redistribution or labor protections, they were often faced with strong opposition from both corporations and foreign governments. Events such as the 1954 coup in Guatemala demonstrated how economic interests could drive political intervention, undermining faith in democratic reform. As instability increased, many military leaders began to view themselves as the only force capable of maintaining order. Coups became common, with officers justifying their actions as necessary to prevent chaos or the spread of communism. In reality, military rule often resulted in authoritarian governments that suppressed political opposition and protected elite interests. By the end of the Cold War, however, many of these dynamics began to shift. Without the same level of ideological pressure, external support for authoritarian regimes declined. Combined with growing public dissatisfaction, this led to a wave of democratization across the region. In conclusion, Latin America during the Cold War illustrates how global ideological conflict interacted with long standing economic dependency and political inequality. The result was a cycle of foreign influence, instability, and authoritarianism that shaped the region's development throughout the 20th century. Lesson 28: Post-colonial independence in Africa, Asia, and the Near East. Following World War II, a wave of decolonization reshaped Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. European empires, weakened economically and politically by the war, could no longer maintain control over their colonies. At the same time, nationalist movements gained momentum as colonial subjects demanded independence and self determination. The war itself had played a key role in this shift. It exposed the vulnerability of European powers, especially after Japan defeated Western forces in Asia, and it spread ideas about freedom and political rights among colonial populations. Millions of colonial soldiers and laborers participated in the war effort and returned home expecting change. When those expectations were not met, independence movements intensified. Additionally, global conditions supported decolonization. Both the United States and the Soviet Union opposed traditional imperialism, at least in principle, and pressured European powers to grant independence. However, while World War II accelerated the end of formal empire, it did not ensure stability for newly independent states. Many post colonial nations inherited significant structural challenges. Colonial boundaries had often been drawn arbitrarily, grouping together diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities within a single state. Once independence was achieved, these divisions frequently led to internal conflict and competition for power. At the same time, political institutions were often weak. Colonial governments had been designed for control and resource extraction, not for democratic participation, leaving new states without strong administrative systems or experienced leadership. Economic challenges further complicated the transition. Most post colonial economies remained dependent on exporting a narrow range of raw materials, making them vulnerable to global market fluctuations. This limited economic growth and contributed to widespread inequality. Rapid population growth and urbanization placed additional strain on these systems. As people moved to cities in search of opportunity, many urban areas expanded faster than infrastructure or industry could support. This led to the development of parasitic cities, where populations grew without corresponding economic productivity, resulting in poverty and overcrowding. External pressures also played a major role. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to influence newly independent nations. This often turned local conflicts into proxy wars, as each superpower supported different factions. In many cases, this external involvement intensified instability rather than resolving it. Even after independence, many countries remained tied to global systems of power through what is often described as neocolonialism. Instead of direct political control, foreign influence continued through economic relationships, trade patterns, and political pressure. Multinational corporations and foreign governments often shaped key sectors of post colonial economies, limiting true independence. Despite these challenges, outcomes varied. Some countries, such as India, were better positioned for success due to stronger institutions and political leadership. India established a democratic system and pursued economic reforms that supported long term development. In conclusion, decolonization marked a major turning point in world history, ending formal empire and creating new nations. However, the legacy of colonial rule combined with Cold War pressures and internal divisions made stable self governance difficult to achieve. As a result, independence was often only the beginning of a much longer and more complex process of nation building. Lesson 29: Asia in the 20th Century. Asia in the 20th century was shaped by a combination of global conflict, ideological transformation, and rapid economic change. The region became a central stage for Cold War competition, while individual countries followed very different paths toward development and modernization. One of the most significant early developments was the Korean War, which marked a turning point in the Cold War. It transformed the conflict from a primarily political and ideological rivalry into a militarized global struggle. When Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, the United States intervened through a United Nations coalition, while China and the Soviet Union supported the North. This established a key Cold War pattern: proxy wars, where superpowers competed indirectly through regional conflicts rather than direct confrontation. The war also accelerated global militarization and reinforced the policy of containment. Japan followed a very different trajectory. After World War II, it underwent significant political and economic restructuring, supported by the United States. Land reform, democratization, and the breakup of large industrial conglomerates created a more stable foundation for growth. The Japanese government worked closely with private industry to guide development, focusing on key sectors such as automobiles and electronics. Combined with a highly educated workforce and efficient production methods, this strategy allowed Japan to become one of the world's leading economic powers by the late 20th century. China's experience highlights both the potential and risks of revolutionary change. The Chinese Communist Party gained strength during the Japanese invasion by building support among the rural population and using guerrilla tactics. After coming to power, Mao Zedong sought to rapidly transform China through programs such as the Great Leap Forward. However, poor planning, unrealistic goals, and mismanagement led to economic failure and widespread famine. Mao later launched the Cultural Revolution in an effort to reassert control and revive revolutionary ideals. But this campaign created political chaos, disrupted education and production, and delayed China's development. The end of the Cultural Revolution marked a turning point. The fall of the Gang of Four signaled a shift away from radical ideological campaigns towards more pragmatic policies. Under new leadership, China began to focus on economic modernization and reform, setting the stage for its later growth. Vietnam provides another important example of how weaker nations could resist more powerful opponents. Despite facing Japan, France, and the United States, Vietnamese forces were able to achieve independence through a combination of strong nationalism, effective leadership, and guerrilla warfare. Rather than relying on conventional military victories, they focused on long term endurance, raising the cost of conflict until foreign powers withdrew. In conclusion, Asia's development in the 20th century reflects a range of different responses to global challenges. Some countries achieved rapid economic growth through state led reform and global integration, while others experienced instability due to ideological conflict and poorly executed policies. Together, these cases demonstrate how global forces and local conditions combined to shape the region's diverse paths to modernization. Lesson 30: The World After the Cold War. The end of the Cold War marked a major turning point in world history, bringing an end to the bipolar global system dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Unlike earlier global conflicts, the Cold War did not end through direct military confrontation, but rather through internal changes within the Soviet Union itself. By the 1980s, the Soviet system was struggling with economic stagnation, inefficiency, and the high cost of maintaining military competition with the United States. Its centrally planned economy was unable to keep pace with technological innovation and consumer demand, leading to declining living standards and growing dissatisfaction. A major turning point came with the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced reforms aimed at revitalizing the Soviet system. His policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, were designed to increase transparency, reduce corruption, and improve economic performance. However, these reforms had unintended consequences. Greater openness allowed criticism of the government to spread, exposing long standing problems and weakening public trust. At the same time, economic restructuring disrupted existing systems without providing immediate improvement, creating further instability. As central authority weakened, the Soviet Union began to lose control over Eastern Europe. Communist governments in the region collapsed, most symbolically marked by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Within the Soviet Union itself, nationalist movements gained strength as various republics pushed for greater autonomy or independence. By 1991, these pressures led to the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union, effectively ending the Cold War. However, the end of the Cold War did not bring global stability. In many regions, underlying tensions resurfaced once the pressure of superpower control was removed. In places such as Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Ethnic divisions, often shaped or intensified by earlier imperial rule, led to violent conflict and even genocide. These events demonstrated how historical legacies could contribute to modern instability. In the Middle East, conflict also persisted. Many states in the region were shaped by artificial boundaries created during the era of imperialism, grouping together diverse populations with competing identities. During the Cold War, authoritarian governments had often suppressed these tensions. After the Cold War, and particularly in the wake of events like the Iraq War and the Arab Spring, weakened state structures allowed ethnic and religious divisions to re emerge more openly. The post Cold War world also saw the rise of new forms of conflict, particularly involving extremist groups. Anti American Islamic extremist violence developed from a combination of political grievances and ideological interpretations of religion. These groups often framed their actions as resistance to foreign intervention in the Middle East. The United States responded with the War on Terror, including military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as expanded global counterterrorism efforts. While these actions demonstrated American military power, they also had mixed consequences, sometimes contributing to instability and affecting the United States' global reputation. In conclusion, the end of the Cold War marked the transition to a new global system, but not one defined by stability. Instead, the modern world is shaped by a combination of historical legacies, shifting power structures, and ongoing conflict. Understanding this period is essential for explaining the complex and interconnected challenges that define the contemporary global landscape.